Welcome to a journey into one of America's darkest mysteries, where an everyday household medicine turned into a weapon of terror. This is the story of the Chicago Tylenol murders. In the crisp chill of early autumn, Chicago in 1982 was a city alive with routine. The hum of traffic along Lakeshore Drive, the rush of office workers in the Loop, children heading back to school after summer. It was a place of rhythm and familiarity. But in late September, something as ordinary as a headache would become the trigger for a nightmare, turning one of America's most trusted household products into an object of dread. It began with a bottle of pills. Tylenol, the brand trusted by millions of Americans, a staple in medicine cabinets across the country. Easy to find, safe to take, and known for its effectiveness. No one could have imagined that inside some of those bottles lurked a silent, invisible killer. On the morning of September 29, 1982, a young girl named Mary Kellerman, just 12 years old, woke up with the sniffles. Her parents thought it was a common cold. To ease her discomfort, they handed her a capsule of extra-strength Tylenol. Moments later, after swallowing the pill, Mary collapsed to the bathroom floor. Her parents frantically dialed emergency services, but it was too late. Mary was gone. A healthy, vibrant child silenced in an instant. Her life cut short by something so familiar, so harmless in appearance that it seemed impossible. That same day, in a nearby Chicago suburb, tragedy struck again. Adam Janus, a 27-year-old postal worker, wasn't feeling well. He reached for a bottle of Tylenol. Hours later, he was dead. His sudden collapse stunned his family. They gathered in his home, distraught, trying to process the unimaginable. In their grief, his brother and sister-in-law also reached for the same bottle of Tylenol, hoping to soothe their pounding headaches brought on by sorrow. Within hours, both of them were also dead. What had begun as one family's grief spiraled into horror. 3 lives lost in a single day, in a single home, from the same bottle of pills. But it didn't stop there. Elsewhere in Chicago, more deaths followed. Mary McFarland, a 31-year-old mother, collapsed at work after taking Tylenol. Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant, was found lifeless in her apartment, the open bottle of Tylenol nearby. Each case was chillingly similar. Healthy individuals, young and old, who had no connection to one another, suddenly struck down by death after swallowing a capsule of America's most trusted pain reliever. Panic began to ripple across the city. What connected these people? How could so many seemingly random deaths occur within hours, all pointing back to the same product? Doctors and investigators scrambled for answers. At first, the possibility of a mysterious illness was considered. Could it be a virus, food poisoning? But then, toxicology tests revealed the horrifying truth. The capsules of Tylenol had been laced with potassium cyanide, a lethal poison. The discovery was like a thunderclap. Potassium cyanide, colorless, odorless in trace amounts, and devastatingly fast-acting. Just a small dose could kill within minutes by suffocating the body's cells, shutting down oxygen use, and leading to rapid organ failure. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't contamination at the factory. This was deliberate. Someone had tampered with bottles of Tylenol, turning an over-the-counter medicine into a weapon. As the news broke, fear spread faster than the poison itself. Supermarket aisles, once filled with trusting customers, became zones of suspicion. People stared at bottles of Tylenol with unease. Some tossed them in the trash, others hid them away. The city of Chicago, and soon the entire nation, found itself gripped by paranoia. Anyone could be the next victim. Anyone could open a bottle and unknowingly consume death. The authorities moved quickly. Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of Tylenol, issued an urgent recall of every bottle of extra-strength Tylenol in the Chicago area, and soon across the United States. Tens of millions of capsules were pulled from shelves, an unprecedented move at the time. Police cars drove through neighborhoods with loudspeakers blaring warnings. Do not take Tylenol. Do not consume any pills. Citizens returned bottles in droves, lines forming at pharmacies as people demanded refunds or simply discarded the products in fear. In the middle of the chaos, the investigation began. Who had done this? How had they managed to poison these capsules? The early theory was chillingly simple. The bottles had not been contaminated at the factory. Instead, the tampering appeared to have been done after the product left Johnson & Johnson's control out in the open at the retail level. Someone had taken bottles off store shelves, opened them, filled the capsules with the cyanide, and then quietly returned them to be sold to unsuspecting customers. The randomness of it all was terrifying. The killer had no pattern of victims. The choice wasn't personal, it was opportunistic. Anyone from a child with a cold to a grieving family member could become the next target. This wasn't murder as the public knew it. This was terror. The FBI, local police, and the FDA joined forces in a task unlike anything seen before. Laboratories tested thousands of bottles. Investigators traced the distribution networks, visiting warehouses, stores, pharmacies. Meanwhile, the media descended on Chicago, amplifying the fear. Headlines screamed of a Tylenol killer, and anchors urged viewers to check their medicine cabinets immediately. Inside homes, families whispered in dread. Parents warned their children not to touch any pills. Housewives poured bottles down kitchen sinks. Strangers eyed each other in drugstores, wondering who among them could have done such a thing. The killer's weapon was not just poison, it was fear, woven into every moment of daily life. For Johnson & Johnson, the disaster was existential. Their best-selling product, the trusted face of their brand, had become synonymous with death. Yet in one of the most remarkable corporate responses in history, the company took unprecedented action. They issued a nationwide recall, removing more than 31 million bottles of Tylenol from shelves, costing them over $100 million. They set up toll-free hotlines, cooperated with investigators, and later pioneered the invention of tamper-proof packaging foil seals, safety caps, and warnings that are standard today. But in 1982, those protections did not exist. Back then, the bottles opened easily, inviting disaster. As the first week of October unfolded, the death toll stood at 7. 7 lives stolen in the span of days. 7 families shattered. And yet investigators knew that the number could have been higher if not for the rapid recall. The randomness of the crime only deepened its darkness. Unlike other killers who stalk specific victims, the Tylenol killer had left the victims to fate. It was the ultimate act of faceless violence. In homes across Chicago, grief turned to anger. Parents buried children. Husbands buried wives. Brothers buried brothers. At funerals, mourners asked the same question. Why? Why would someone do this? What kind of person could hide death inside a pill? The investigation pressed on, but from the very start, it faced daunting obstacles. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no surveillance cameras. In 1982, forensic science was primitive compared to today's standards. DNA testing was a distant dream. Detectives had little to work with besides the poisoned bottles and the grim tally of the dead. And in the shadows, somewhere in the city, the killer walked free. Perhaps they watched the panic they had caused. Perhaps they smiled at the chaos flashing across television screens. Or perhaps, chillingly, they planned to strike again. Chicago was paralyzed by fear. Pharmacies locked their doors. Supermarkets cleared shelves. Even products unrelated to Tylenol were eyed with suspicion. Pills, once seen as solutions to pain, now carried the promise of death. The city had never known a crime quite like this, not a shooting, not a stabbing, not a robbery. This was something else entirely. This was murder by manipulation. A faceless killer had weaponized trust itself, and the world would never look at a bottle of pills the same way again. And so began one of the most chilling manhunts in American history. A race against time to find a killer who struck not from the shadows of alleys, but from the shelves of everyday life. The Tylenol murders had only just begun. The deaths had been swift, merciless, and cruelly ordinary. But in the days that followed, the aftermath was anything but ordinary. Chicago was no longer just a city. It had become the epicenter of a nightmare that was rippling across the United States. For investigators, time was their most relentless enemy. If the killer had struck once, what was to stop them from striking again? By the first week of October 1982, the city was gripped by terror. It was not just 7 deaths. It was 7 deaths that could have been multiplied hundreds, even thousands of times over. Every medicine cabinet became a source of paranoia. Every capsule swallowed was a game of chance. The killer had weaponized a household item that nearly every American trusted, and in doing so, they had turned the ordinary into the ominous. Investigators fanned out across Chicago, armed with flashlights, gloves, and evidence bags. Pharmacies and supermarkets were raided. Shelves were cleared of Tylenol products. Police and FDA officials collected bottles, boxes, and capsules, examining each one for signs of tampering. But the killer had been careful, almost mocking in their simplicity. The capsules looked normal. It was only when they were broken apart and tested in a lab that the cyanide revealed itself, a hidden killer waiting inside. Laboratories across Illinois went into overdrive. Bottles were opened, contents examined, tests run. The grim reality emerged quickly. More than 75 bottles of Tylenol were found to be laced with cyanide. Each one of those bottles could have killed multiple people. Each one had been sold, returned to shelves, and placed in the hands of unsuspecting families. The scope of the crime was larger, darker than anyone had feared. For the families of the victims, grief had turned into a hollow silence. At Mary Kellerman's funeral, her parents clutched photographs of their daughter, stunned that a simple pill had stolen her life. For the Janus family, the tragedy was nearly incomprehensible, burying 3 loved ones within days, their home now forever marked as the place where Tylenol had torn a hole in their lives. And yet, beyond the grief, there was rage. Chicagoans demanded answers. How could this happen? Who had done this? And why wasn't anyone behind bars? For investigators, those questions cut like knives. They had no fingerprints, no witnesses, no surveillance tapes to review. In 1982, there were no cameras in every store aisle, no digital trail to follow. The killer had acted in anonymity, slipping through the cracks of a society that still believed in trust. One of the earliest theories was both horrifying and difficult to prove. That the killer had physically walked into local stores, taken bottles of Tylenol off the shelves, opened them at home, replaced some capsules with cyanide-laced ones, resealed the bottles as best they could, and then returned them quietly. The thought was chilling in its simplicity. The killer had mingled with ordinary shoppers, strolling past cereal boxes and canned goods, before sliding the altered product back into place. They had counted on the fact that no one would notice the subtle difference, and they had been right. Law enforcement agencies began working together in a frenzy of coordination. The FBI, the Food and Drug Administration, and local police forces created one of the largest joint investigations in Chicago's history. Agents interviewed store clerks, managers, pharmacists, and delivery drivers. They traced the distribution routes of Tylenol, following the chain from warehouses to retail shelves. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized the horrifying truth. This crime wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't the work of a criminal mastermind with insider access. It was the work of someone exploiting the vulnerabilities of an everyday product. Meanwhile, the media amplified the fear. Television anchors spoke in urgent tones. Newspapers printed headlines that screamed of poison pills and faceless killers. Across the nation, viewers watched in disbelief. If it could happen in Chicago, could it happen anywhere? What if the killer had traveled, spreading poisoned bottles across multiple states? Every pharmacy in America seemed suddenly dangerous. The panic spread far beyond Illinois. In New York, Boston, Los Angeles, everywhere families checked their medicine cabinets. Calls flooded police hotlines with reports of suspicious pills. Hospitals were inundated with patients convinced they had been poisoned. A wave of false alarms rippled across the country, each one fueled by the paranoia that the Tylenol killer might still be at large. And yet, amidst the panic, there were moments that revealed just how fragile the country's sense of safety had become. In Chicago, police cars drove through neighborhoods with loudspeakers blaring. Do not consume Tylenol. Destroy any capsules you have. Do not take the risk. Citizens lined up outside pharmacies, returning bottles in droves. Millions of dollars worth of Tylenol was tossed into trash bins, flushed down toilets, poured down sinks. America had never seen a consumer recall on this scale before. For Johnson & Johnson, the company that made Tylenol, the crisis was nothing short of catastrophic. Their flagship product had become a national symbol of fear. But instead of hiding, they confronted the disaster head-on. They recalled 31 million bottles of Tylenol nationwide. They halted all advertising, opened emergency hotlines, and promised full cooperation with authorities. It was a move that cost them over $100 million, but it also set a precedent for corporate crisis management. Still, no corporate response could erase the deaths, nor could it soothe the dread that had taken hold of American households. Meanwhile, inside the FBI's Chicago field office, the search for suspects intensified. The problem was that the killer could be anyone. There was no clear motive, no ransom note, no demand for money. Unlike serial killers, who often left behind a psychological signature, the Tylenol killer seemed invisible, their only message delivered through death itself. One name did emerge early: James W. Lewis. A man with a long history of criminal behavior, Lewis had written a letter to Johnson & Johnson, demanding $1 million to stop the killings. In the letter, he claimed responsibility for the poisoning. The note was crude, demanding money be deposited in a bank account, with the promise that the killings would cease if the demand was met. Investigators traced the letter back to Lewis, who was quickly arrested. But the case against him unraveled almost as quickly as it began. While Lewis had indeed written the extortion letter, there was no physical evidence linking him to the poisoned bottles. His handwriting was sloppy, his threats vague, and investigators soon realized that he was likely an opportunist, someone trying to exploit the chaos for financial gain, rather than the true killer. Lewis would eventually serve time for extortion, but not for murder. The families of the victims were left with no closure. The killer was still out there. Other suspects surfaced and faded just as quickly. Store clerks, pharmacists, truck drivers, anyone who had touched the product became a person of interest. Dozens were questioned, their lives dissected under the glare of suspicion. But in the end, no charges stuck. The killer had left behind no fingerprints, no DNA, no trail, just empty bottles and broken families. As October bled into November, the fear began to shift. The immediate panic quieted, but the paranoia lingered. The Tylenol murders had forever changed how Americans thought about safety. Before 1982, the idea of product tampering was almost unthinkable. Now it was a constant shadow. In the months that followed, copycat crimes surfaced across the country: poisoned foods, altered drinks, contaminated products. Most were hoaxes, but a few were terrifyingly real. The Tylenol murders had planted an idea in the collective mind: the notion that anyone could take something ordinary and make it deadly. Back in Chicago, investigators pushed forward. They scrutinized the timeline of the victims. Mary Kellerman's death in the early morning, Adam Janus in the afternoon, his relatives that same evening, each death traced back to a capsule purchased in the Chicago metropolitan area. But the randomness was the most difficult part. The victims had no connection to one another. They didn't share workplaces, schools, or social circles. The only link was Tylenol, and that made the killer's selection all the more chilling because it meant the killer hadn't chosen the people. They had chosen the product. And so the question remained: who would do this? Why? Was it the work of a disgruntled employee? A chemical expert seeking revenge? A terrorist trying to sow fear? Or was it, as some investigators feared, something even more terrifying, an anonymous predator, striking not for gain, not for ideology, but for the sheer thrill of watching chaos unfold? As winter approached, the streets of Chicago returned to routine. Shoppers filled aisles again. Children played in snow. But something had changed, something invisible but permanent. Trust had been shattered. No one looked at a bottle of pills the same way again. The once innocent act of swallowing medicine had become tinged with dread. The investigation pressed on, but the killer remained nameless, faceless. Somewhere in America, perhaps even walking the streets of Chicago, the person who had poisoned those capsules was alive, watching, perhaps smiling at the fear they had unleashed. The FBI had suspects, but no proof. The families had questions, but no answers. And the city had scars that would never fully heal. The Tylenol murders were no longer just a Chicago story. They were a national nightmare, a grim reminder that safety could vanish in an instant, and that death could hide in plain sight. And for investigators, the race to catch the killer was turning into a desperate struggle against time and silence. The weeks following the Tylenol murders blurred into months. Chicago returned to its routines, but the echoes of panic lingered. The bottles were off the shelves, the funerals had been held, but the haunting question still remained: who had poisoned America's medicine cabinet? Detectives pored over evidence files, each page marked with the names of the dead Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, his brother Stanley, his sister-in-law Teresa, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Reiner. 7 innocent lives, tied together by a killer who left no trail. It was unlike any case law enforcement had faced before. The investigation had suspects, but none who fit neatly into the role of the Tylenol killer. The most notorious name remained James W. Lewis, the man who had sent a crude ransom letter to Johnson & Johnson. In the note, Lewis demanded $1 million, claiming he could stop the killings if the company paid up. To many, it looked like a confession, but the evidence didn't align. When agents dug into Lewis's background, they found a history of fraud, forgery, and unstable behavior. He had a criminal record stretching back years, filled with financial schemes and shady dealings. But he didn't have the chemical knowledge or direct access to the poisoned bottles. Investigators searched his home, interviewed his associates, scrutinized his movements. Still, no cyanide, no capsules, no link to the crime emerged. In 1983, Lewis was convicted not for murder, but for extortion. He spent over a decade behind bars, yet many remained suspicious. Some believed he had been the killer all along, and that his extortion letter was a reckless slip, a moment of arrogance that exposed his involvement. Others thought he was merely an opportunist, feeding off the chaos for his own gain. The truth lay somewhere in the shadows, beyond the reach of hard evidence. Another man came under the microscope, Roger Arnold, a dockhand at a chemical plant. Arnold had boasted in bars about having cyanide, about knowing how to make someone disappear. His odd behavior and access to chemicals put him on the FBI's radar. For weeks, surveillance teams followed him, watching his every move. Arnold cracked under the pressure. Paranoia consumed him. He grew convinced that someone was following him, that his life was in danger. One night, in a fit of rage, Arnold confronted a man outside a local tavern. Believing him to be one of the people tailing him, Arnold pulled a gun and shot him dead. But he had killed the wrong man, an innocent bystander, with no connection to the Tylenol investigation. Arnold was arrested and convicted of murder, but not the murders that had brought him under suspicion in the first place. He spent years in prison, another shadow figure in the orbit of the case, but never officially tied to the poisoned capsules. The list of suspects grew long, then short, then long again. Store clerks, warehouse employees, pharmacists, disgruntled ex-workers of Johnson & Johnson. Anyone with even the faintest proximity to Tylenol became a person of interest. But every lead fizzled, every suspect proved hollow. The killer remained invisible. And as investigators struggled to find the culprit, America faced another chilling reality. The Tylenol murders had opened a door that could not be closed. Across the country, a wave of copycat crimes began to surface. People began tampering with products, sometimes as hoaxes, sometimes with lethal intent. In California, bottles of Tylenol were discovered with rat poison inside. In Michigan, aspirin capsules were found to contain strychnine. In Connecticut, eye drops were contaminated. The nation's newfound paranoia was not just about one killer anymore. It was about the realization that product tampering was terrifyingly easy. The Tylenol murders had set a precedent, and others were following the blueprint. Most of these cases turned out to be hoaxes, pranks by people seeking attention or hoping to sow fear. But a few were real. Lives were lost in scattered incidents across the country, poisoned by tampered products. The Tylenol case had awakened something sinister, an idea that, once introduced into the public consciousness, could not be forgotten. The government scrambled to respond. In 1983, Congress passed the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, making it a federal crime to maliciously alter consumer products. The law carried severe penalties up to life in prison for those whose tampering resulted in death. It was a desperate attempt to close a door that had already been blown wide open. At the same time, the very way Americans consume medicine changed forever. Johnson & Johnson pioneered tamper-evident packaging foil seals, child-proof caps, shrink wraps. What was once a simple plastic bottle became a fortress of protection. Every click, every seal broken, every plastic layer peeled away was born from the fear of the Tylenol murders. What is now so ordinary was once revolutionary. But for investigators, new laws and packaging weren't enough. They wanted the killer. They needed the killer. Yet years slipped by with no answers. Inside the FBI, case files stacked higher, photographs of victims fading at the edges. Investigators aged, retired, died. The case passed from one generation of detectives to the next, each inheriting the same haunting puzzle. Who was the Tylenol killer? Where had they gone? Why had they stopped? That question, more than anything else, tormented investigators. Why had the killings ended as suddenly as they had begun? 7 lives taken in just a few days, then nothing. No second wave, no follow-up, no return of the poisoned bottles. The silence was eerie, almost taunting. Some theorized that the killer had meant to strike once, to create chaos and then vanish. Others believed the killer had panicked, fearing capture, and retreated into anonymity. Still others whispered darker possibilities that the killer had died, or had been arrested for some unrelated crime, serving time while the mystery remained unsolved. But in the absence of answers, fear filled the void. Parents checked every pill their children swallowed. Pharmacists eyed their shelves with suspicion. A bottle of Tylenol, once a symbol of relief, had become a ghost in plastic, carrying with it memories of 7 deaths. As the years stretched into decades, the Tylenol murders became more than just a case. They became a legend, a whispered, cautionary tale told to children and adults alike. Every foil seal broken on a bottle of pills was a reminder of the faceless killer who had once stalked Chicago's pharmacies. And yet for the families, it was not a legend. It was not folklore. It was grief, raw and permanent. Mary Kellerman would never graduate high school. Adam Janus's family would never gather without remembering that day of shared tragedy. Paula Prince's apartment, where her body was found beside the bottle of Tylenol, would always be a tomb in memory. The city of Chicago wore its scars in silence. On anniversaries of the murders, news stations revisited the case. Former detectives were interviewed, their voices weary, their words tinged with frustration. They spoke of dead ends, of suspects who slipped through their fingers, of the killer who had never been caught. In those interviews, one detail always surfaced: the chilling randomness of it all. These victims hadn't been targeted. They hadn't been stalked or chosen for personal reasons. They had simply reached for medicine. And in that randomness lay the terror. Because if the killer could strike once, could they not strike again? The Tylenol murders were never solved. No one was ever charged with the 7 deaths. The case remained open, a cold file in FBI archives, a ghost haunting the corridors of law enforcement. But the ripples of the crime never stopped. Every safety seal, every tamper-proof lid, every warning label on consumer products bore the fingerprints of the faceless killer who had never been caught. The story of the Tylenol murders is not just one of death. It is one of paranoia, of shattered trust, of the dark realization that danger can lurk in the most ordinary of places. For investigators, the case was a nightmare with no ending. For the public, it was a wound that reshaped the way they lived. But for the killer, whoever they were, it was a crime that disappeared into silence. A crime that left no face, no name, only fear. And as the 20th century turned into the 21st, the shadow of the Tylenol killer still stretched long, reminding America that some nightmares never end. The Chicago Tylenol murders did not end with the immediate panic of late 1982. In fact, in many ways, the nightmare was only beginning. What had started as a handful of deaths in the Chicago suburbs quickly expanded into a sprawling criminal investigation, a media storm, and a cultural reckoning. The entire nation now lived under the shadow of poisoned consumer goods. Fear was everywhere, suspicion was everywhere, and for detectives, the most haunting realization was this: the killer could still be out there, watching, waiting, maybe even planning to strike again. After the initial deaths and the shocking recall, law enforcement agencies had to contend with the overwhelming weight of public terror. Phone lines were jammed with false reports, hoaxes, and genuine tips. Every week, hundreds of leads poured in. Investigators chased them, but each one ended in frustration. The poison bottles had been plucked from the store shelves at random, laced with potassium cyanide, and then returned to the aisles. There were no cameras in stores. There were no digital transaction records. The crime had been committed in the open, in broad daylight, yet in a way that left behind no fingerprints, no DNA, no trace. The killer was invisible. The Food and Drug Administration began cracking down on product safety across industries. But even with stronger packaging laws on the horizon, Chicago couldn't breathe easily. In the months after the murders, dozens of copycat cases emerged across the country. From New York to California, panicked reports surfaced of poisoned soda, cyanide-laced aspirin, even tainted eye drops. Most turned out to be hoaxes, but some were real. A poisoned bottle of Tylenol was discovered in a safe deposit box. In another city, someone reported finding puncture marks in sealed containers. The atmosphere of dread seemed to give birth to a new, twisted type of criminal. People who didn't kill for profit or even revenge, but to inspire chaos. In Chicago, the funerals of the victims became focal points of the community's grief. Families clutched photos of their loved ones. Media vans crowded outside churches. Strangers cried for people they had never met. The pain was compounded by the randomness of it all. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman should have been safe in her bathroom. Adam Janus should have been safe taking medicine for chest pain. Stanley and Teresa Janus should have been safe in their home. These weren't people taking risks. They weren't drug users or thrill seekers. They were ordinary men, women, and children. And that was what made the crime so terrifying. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. The FBI began working alongside local authorities, but progress was slow. By the spring of 1983, one name began to dominate the investigation: James William Lewis. A man living in New York, Lewis was arrested after sending a letter to Johnson & Johnson, demanding $1 million to stop the killings. In his letter, he claimed to be responsible, and he outlined the method by which the poison had been administered. At first, investigators thought they had their man, but the deeper they dug, the less clear it became. Lewis had no physical link to the crime scenes. He had never been in Chicago during the time of the murders. What he had instead was a motive for extortion. Prosecutors eventually secured a conviction against him, not for the murders, but for attempting to extort Johnson & Johnson. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But in the minds of many investigators, he remained a prime suspect. Even decades later, when questioned by journalists, Lewis smiled cryptically, dodging questions, offering just enough words to stir suspicion without admitting guilt. Some believed he thrived on the notoriety, living in the shadows of the killings without ever confessing to them. But if not Lewis, then who? Over the years, countless theories surfaced. Some investigators suspected a disgruntled employee of Johnson & Johnson, someone with access to the production line who might have tampered with the bottles before they even hit the shelves. Others speculated it was a random sociopath who found pleasure in inflicting chaos. There were even theories of a foreign agent testing America's vulnerabilities, but each theory collapsed under scrutiny. There was no evidence, no fingerprints, no smoking gun. As the years stretched into decades, the Chicago Tylenol murders remained one of the most baffling, unsolved crimes in American history. What made the case especially haunting was its ripple effect. The tragedy reshaped the way Americans interacted with the consumer goods. Before 1982, tamper-evident packaging was rare. After 1982, it became the law. Every bottle you ever twisted open and heard the crack of a safety seal. Every foil wrapper you've peeled back from a bottle of pills. Every child-proof cap you struggled with. All of it exists because of the Tylenol murders. Out of horror came reform. Out of tragedy came safety. But the reform couldn't undo the pain, nor could it erase the mystery. For the families, closure never came. Every birthday, every holiday, every year that passed was a reminder of the lives stolen. Media interviews decades later showed parents still weeping, siblings still haunted. They wanted justice. They wanted answers. And they would never get them. Detectives who worked the case described it as a phantom crime. The killer had left nothing behind but death. And yet, the psychological footprint was massive. Even now, investigators say that one of the greatest dangers of the Tylenol murders was how easy they were to replicate. A stranger could walk into any store, tamper with the product, and vanish. That fear lingered. Every Halloween, parents checked candy obsessively. Every grocery trip came with a second look at the packaging. Suspicion became part of everyday life. The killer hadn't just taken lives, they had stolen peace of mind. Decades later, in the 2000s and 2010s, cold case detectives revisited the Tylenol files. DNA analysis, chemical testing, and modern forensic methods were applied. Once again, James Lewis's name came up, but nothing definitive tied him to the murders. He was interviewed, his home was searched, evidence was re-examined. Still, the smoking gun never appeared. In 2023, Lewis died at the age of 76. With him, perhaps, went the truth. If he had been the killer, he never confessed. If he hadn't been, then the real murderer was still nameless, faceless, a shadow lost to time. And so the Tylenol murders remain what they have always been, a story of horror without an ending, a case where innocence was shattered, where a bottle of medicine turned into an instrument of death, where an entire nation learned how fragile safety really is. The tragedy sits in the pantheon of America's darkest, unsolved mysteries, alongside the Zodiac Killer, the Black Dahlia, and the Long Island serial killer. Each case is different, but each carries the same weight, a reminder that sometimes evil slips through the cracks, leaving behind only scars. The Chicago Tylenol murders were not just a crime, they were a warning, a reminder that danger can come from the most ordinary places, that the trust we put in products, in routines, in the safety of daily life, can be shattered in an instant. And that sometimes, no matter how hard investigators work, no matter how deeply families grieve, no matter how much the world demands answers, the truth may never come. To this day, survivors and families of the victims live under the long shadow of 1982. The tragedy lingers not just in the history books, but in the way we all live our lives. We twist caps, peel seals, and look for signs that what we're about to consume is safe. We do it without thinking. But somewhere deep down, that habit is rooted in fear. The fear that began in Chicago with a handful of bottles of Tylenol and a faceless killer who walked into the night, never to be caught. And so the story ends not with justice, not with resolution, but with silence. A silence that echoes in every medicine cabinet, in every household, in every shadowed memory of that dark autumn in 1982. The Chicago Tylenol murders are not just an unsolved crime. They are a haunting, a whisper that reminds us that sometimes the scariest monsters are not the ones hiding in the dark, but the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting on a store shelf. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share